welcome to Race in the City. It's an honor to introduce Melanie Moon, our leader of our critical conversations. Melanie was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. She attended Evanston Elementary School until 7th grade when her parents moved to Glendale. She graduated from Princeton High School in 1971 and Miami University in 1975. She earned a master's degree in library science at the University of Kentucky and another in childhood development at the University of Cincinnati while raising her now 4 grown children. Melanie served as library director for Princeton City Schools, Cincinnati Hills Christian Academy, Brown Mackie College, and Greater Emmanuel Apostolic Temple, where she has also served as a deaconess for several years. Melanie feels led to God to do this work of racial justice, not just because of the state of our world today, but to clear a path for Sesman, Naomi, Brooke, and Daphne, her grandchildren. Melanie, before I introduce Dr. Berteau, would you kind of comment on the idea of chapter champions so we'll know how the event will run this evening?
Sure, absolutely. The book is a compilation of scholarly essays. And so it's just not the kind of book that you sit down with your cat and your shawl and a cup of tea. It's just not that kind of book. And I just knew that everyone was not going to read it, but I feel that every Cincinnatian should become familiar with this book in one way or another. So rather than task people with reading the entire book, I asked for friends and relatives to serve as a champion of one chapter, just one chapter, become familiar with that one chapter. And when we are asked to do a presentation such as this evening, of course, Catherine and the public librarians are serving as chapter champions, but I have a couple of my champions in here with me this evening, Cassie and Laurie. Just wave your hands. They're chapter champions, and so when we give a presentation, they are responsible for their chapter. And just sort of to divvy up the responsibility of such an intense book. It's intense and it's very data detail driven. A lot of charts, maps, graphs, and just things that a lot of people don't feel comfortable with. So that's where we came up with the chapter champions.
David, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. You're muted.
As many of you know here tonight, I have that, as many of us do. We have to have the icebreaker of the mic problem. Sorry about that. But I was eager to introduce Dr. Nancy Berteau, the author of the chapter that we're discussing tonight, Structural Economic Change and Occupational Decline Among Black Workers in 19th Century Cincinnati. Dr. Nancy Berteau is a professor of economics at Xavier University, holding a PhD and MA in economics from the University of Michigan and BA in economics summa cum laude Phi Beta Kappa from Colgate University. As an undergraduate, she participated in Colgate's Washington, D.C. semester, the oldest in the nation, and an academic program on economic development in Jamaica. She has worked at the Urban Institute, the Inter-American Foundation, and the Department of Navy in Washington, D.C., and at General Electric Company here in Cincinnati. She has consulted on legal and diversity matters and has published over 30 articles in scholarly journals and a book on issues of international economic development, workforce diversity, economic thought, and economic history. Welcome, Dr. Berteau.
Thank you so much, David. And Melanie, I have to do the Cincinnati thing. I went to Princeton High School and indeed lived in Glendale in the same general era as you. We then moved to Pennsylvania because my dad was a GE engineer, and then he was transferred to Erie, Pennsylvania. when I guess I was a sophomore, but I was junior. So I was at Princeton up through my sophomore year, which would have been the early 70s. I'd have to check it out to me. And my older sister is named Michelle Berteau. So I don't know if that rings any bells with you, because I think you're just a couple years ahead of me at Princeton. And when anybody ever asks me, this is why I think it's relevant for this session, what got you interested in diversity? I always say Princeton High School, okay? Because I was there in the years where we merged with Lincoln Heights, Sharonville, Glendale, and I was a founding member on, I don't know, there was some announcement that came up about founding the Princeton Interracial Club. So I joined that, and that really changed the course of my life and my interests. Also, while there, I joined the Explorer Scout Troop, which is a co-ed scout troop where we did the cleanup of the Little Miami River. And part of the Little Miami River that is currently designated a scenic river is done because of the activities that our scout troop organized. So, and what I'd like to say is that my most recent research interest in the area of diversity, especially racial diversity, it has to do with environmental justice and the idea that a lot of the sustainability issues facing our society and our planet are incredibly falling harder on our African American and other citizens of color. And so we really really need to pay a lot more attention to those issues. So both of them were, formed while at Princeton High School. So it's just too funny that you're a fellow Princeton. I didn't graduate from there because we moved, as I say, after my sophomore year, and I spent a year or two up in Pennsylvania. But I consider myself really a Princeton alum, even though I'm not on the grads list. So there you go. I'm gonna not say too much, except for I congratulate you on. It was like when I got this email from Melanie that they're gonna take on this like really scholarly work with all of this, like you say, data and graphs and all the rest of it, and put it in a book club. I was like, how cool is that? I mean, Cincinnati Public Library needs to pat themselves on the back. And then I thought, well, probably it's because there's so little written. That's all I could find. And I just wanted to speak to that in a serious way, because when I started my dissertation from the University of Michigan, it was on the history of 19th century workers as a whole in Cincinnati, Ohio, from 1801 to 1899. I stopped at 1900. And I did a case study, by the way, on Cincinnati public school teachers. So I did overall data, and I ended up looking at it by race, by national origin. There was a lot of issues with people of German origin at that time, and by gender. And I'm telling you, I ended up doing some further publications that looked at occupational segregation, which is basically different jobs for men and women, different jobs for basically, in this area at that time, it was basically blacks and whites. There really weren't a lot of other ethnic groups, but I also looked at German-born citizens or non-native citizens in general, which were somewhat diverse, but had a lot of Germans, a lot of Irish too. And when we looked at those occupational patterns, it was like, oh my God, like there really isn't a lot of overlap here. Like different groups are like doing different jobs. And I had some of the contemporary economists who were on my dissertation committee at the University of Michigan say straight to my face, you know what? I always wondered whether there was this wage discrimination thing. Was it real? It was really explainable by A, B, C, D, E. And when I read your dissertation, it was so pointed and so detailed. It's proof. It's just, there is no other answer. Like women teachers were paid half of what men were, and they talk about it in the school board reports. Like, we don't have to pay them more because all they can do is be a domestic servant or maybe a seamstress, and that's it. And guess what Black women did at that time? They were laundresses, okay, which was the worst, heaviest, most physically demanding work there was, and to a lesser extent, domestic service. And that was pretty much all I did. And, Black men were common laborers. Okay. And I had an article that was published called Barbers, Servants, Teachers, and something else. So they were also barbers, which was a pretty good job at that time. And then the white men had like hundreds of categories to choose from. And it was just like, there it is, right? So this work in this chapter is really, I got interested in that, and this became an offshoot of that work in my dissertation. Similarly, my work, the second half of my dissertation is the case study on Cincinnati public school teachers. And I literally went into, in the Board of Education, some of the historian or the guys that worked there, the managers had in their vault, like the old ledgers of teachers from 1820 and 1823. And I literally picked all that data off of handwritten records. And I don't know if you know this, but usually what you do with data is you take a random sample and you get all the details. I didn't do that. I was a crazy young person. I did 100% of everything because I wanted to be as accurate as possible. I didn't want anybody to say, oh no, there's really not discrimination. I'm like, this is it. To the point where when my committee looked at it, some of them were actually confused. They didn't know what to do with the statistics because usually there's these confidence intervals and so forth that you use when you have a sample. But I'm like, this is all the data. And I finally had to have another professor say, look, she doesn't need confidence intervals. This is the data. It is what it is. There's no error here. It's just, and so when I did the school teachers, I found literally in the reports, at the end, here's what's happening in the quote colored schools. I was like, well, that's interesting. So I got into them, and I published some work specifically on the quote colored schools of Cincinnati, and they were super fascinating because they had all Black teachers and Black principals, right? And so they were, a self-stand. Now, then here comes the real dilemma, because they are fighting for integration. They're fighting for funding. They're fighting for space that's not like some unheated basement in a church, that kind of thing. But at the same time, what ultimately happens when they're integrated in the 1870s is that the system tries to take away all the Black teachers and the principals. Because and they're like, no, we don't want that, So there becomes this sort of tussle. And as what happens is the Black community demands that they keep some of these Black schools open, which they do right up for decades and decades, specifically because they're allowed to have Black teachers and principals at that school. Okay. And that's why we have Peter Clark Academy, and he's one of the Black principals, so there's this fascinating teacher history too, that I think I mentioned a little bit in this chapter. So that's kind of how this work grew out of. And the other thing I would just say is that Henry Taylor was like the most awesome person to work with, because if anybody knows anything about how these edited collections go, it's usually like you're working on your own, you commit, you give the chapter, or they like proofread it or whatever, and then like that's the end of it. Oh no, not Henry. We booked, I'll bet we booked 100 hours of phone conversations, because he was up in Buffalo by then, about what do you think about this? What about that? I have this idea about that. Does the data show that? I mean, it was really, unlike most edited volumes, I would say that whole freaking book is really co-authored by Henry. So that was that was the first thing I ever co-authored. And I liked that experience so much that I almost have nothing that's solo authored since then. So Henry changed my life too, by just introducing me to the joys of really, working with another scholar and bouncing ideas off of each other. So with that, I'll just say, I think that the chapter speaks for itself. If you can wade through the data, it's like, the people have to deal with the opportunities that are open to them, right? And so the idea that, we can all make these choices. You can only make choices when you have those choices truly available to you in a full sense. And I think this whole book really was there to document the the limited nature of the choices that the Black community was faced with, and the immense creativity and adaptiveness and resilience that they showed in the face of that, to be awesome and negotiate rivulets and side entrances and the courage that they showed. And so I think it's wonderful to see some more contemporary scholarship coming out. I will also say, and in writing the works that I did on Black Cincinnati, I always tried to work with Black authors. Another author I worked with was Michael Washington from Northern Kentucky University. He and I worked on a bunch of stuff together. And it was, I mean, literally Michael and I had a study group where we read everything that had ever been written at that time, which was probably like the late night, working on the year 2000, that featured research on Black Cincinnati. And it was sad that we could do that in a matter of, a semester or two, reading fast, but nevertheless, we read every dissertation. I mean, there were literally, almost no books at all. There have been a couple of books since, but there's still a fairly, you could read everything that's been written about Black Cincinnati in a scholarly manner. You could actually do that, which that's sad, right? Because there aren't that many subfields that you can do that. Usually there's just more than you can read. And I would also say that I'd like to give credit to Zane Miller, who's no longer with us, at the University of Cincinnati, who was a history professor, and a lot of his students did their dissertations on Black history topics, and there were others, but Zane in particular was really good at telling people, this is a great topic, you should work on this. So, so glad you guys found it. I hope you didn't fall asleep too much. It's the kind of thing you got to slap yourself upside the head a few times while you read it, make sure you don't fall asleep. But the points that it makes, I think, are pretty compelling. So that's all I'll have to say. I'm sorry I have to go in a minute, but if anybody has any opening questions before I have to go, and I hope you have a great dialogue, and feel free to email me at berto@xavier.edu if you want to ask any follow-up questions that I wasn't here to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Bartow. Would you kindly put your email address in our chat so we'll have that? Thank you. And we're looking forward to an interactive dialogue tonight. So I'm very happy to introduce Catherine Turin-Jones, the manager of our Norwood Branch Library. Catherine is our chapter champion tonight. So thank you again, Dr. Bartow, for learning more about the background and the scope and your motivation for the illuminating history that we will discuss tonight. So without further ado, Catherine, and I believe Catherine has some conversation starters as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine. I'm at the Norwood Library. If you ever want to come see me, I'm here all the time. And I am a part of the committee that David was referring to, the Black Events and Exhibits Committee. And that's how I got involved with this project. I am so very happy to see all of you here tonight. It really, it touched me when we had this many registrants. So I'm very happy to be a part of this discussion this evening. And it's my task to try and distill some of this information, and in the interest of time, point out some key information and try and make it a little more palatable so we can have a discussion around some of the key points. David has volunteered to keep an eye on the chat for me so I can kind of just plow through and get my part of it out there. For those of you who have listened to it or had a chance to get your hands on the books, that's great. I'm going to use some notes here and I'll just jump right in. I'm going to share my screen off and on so that I don't meander, and so that people who are visual learners can have a little bit of something to keep us on task. So, Race in the City, Chapter 5. It's very eye-opening, things that I maybe knew a tiny bit about or never heard of at all. It really engaged me. I had no problem. I didn't have to smack myself to stay awake. It was very interesting. So the key component is that occupational segregation by race has been a key factor in keeping Blacks as a group at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. That is the premise of this chapter. There are two schools of thought around this topic. Labor supply deficits of Blacks, such as lesser quality education, training, and work experience, have resulted in a concentration in lower paying, lower prestige jobs. The other school of thought that I have bullet pointed here is racial discrimination and racist practices from employers, white employees, and labor institutions have kept Blacks from achieving a more equitable occupational distribution. And that is what we're focusing on tonight. Because from where I'm sitting, the first bullet point there doesn't even exist without the second bullet point. I think we can all agree on that. So that's where we're coming from. I kind of grouped the information into 3 topics. There is a lot of data that Dr. Berteau shares in the chapter, and it's incredible the amount of information she was able to really dig into, considering that we're focusing on the 19th century, so 1800s, the very early part of the century up through the 1890s. And a lot of the information that is relevant to this topic wasn't collected in census until I think 1860 and on. So the research that Dr. Berteau did is just incredible. And some of it is anecdotal, but I think those are the bits of the chapter that really brought it to life for me. So we'll get into that a little bit. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the population of Cincinnati in this time period. Since workers are drawn from, let me go down so you guys can see where I'm heading. Since workers are drawn from overall population trends are important in understanding labor force trends. So, although Cincinnati's Black population was under 5% through the century, the Black population in Cincinnati was one of the largest among all the northern cities. That gives you a little snapshot of where we're at here. Being a borderland, it's referred to as a borderland city. Cincinnati was both a hotbed of abolitionism and subject to frequent outbreaks of extreme racism. So this affected the population. The abolitionists are more of what I learned about in school. And if you ever have a chance to go to the National Underground Freedom Center, it's a wonderful place to visit. But some of this was really shocking and eye-opening to me. And I want to read a little bit of a passage from the book. And I'll go back on here so I can see all your faces. As I read through the book, and the notes that I took are directly from the book. So I do want to acknowledge that some of the language is uncomfortable or outdated, but I'm going to read directly from it so we can get the true feeling of what is being expressed here. So it says there was a blatant example of that extreme racism that occurred in the late 1820s, when at least 1,000 Blacks, which was probably about half of the Black population in Cincinnati, were driven from the city by whites determined to enforce Ohio's previously inactive Black laws. Now, I paused there because I thought, what are Ohio's Black laws? I've never heard of this. And maybe they've upgraded Ohio history since I was in school. It's been a while, but it really gave me pause because I thought, well, we're a free state and we wouldn't have anything like this. But come to find out that Ohio's Black laws had been passed in the 1804 to 1807 years, and they required all Blacks to register with local officials, show certificates of freedom, and post a bond of $500 to guarantee good behavior, quote unquote. These laws also prohibited Blacks from testifying against whites in court, holding public office, or serving in the military. Ohio's 1802 Constitution had already denied Blacks suffrage. So we're talking about people who cannot vote, cannot testify in court, and basically have to go above and way beyond what any reasonable person would have to do just in order to live in the state of Ohio. And that really kind of set the tone for me as I was reading the rest of the chapter. Maybe we can talk about that later if anybody else had heard of those laws before. So this, I'm going to share my screen again. This population trend, this little graph, it was written out in the chapter, but I was having trouble visualizing it. So I made a little graph so that you can see the early part of the century, and then dipping down the mid part of the century, the decades before, during, and after the Civil War, and then going back up post-Civil War and during the industrialization time of Cincinnati's history. So that's what she was talking about with the U-shape, the racist practices plus, and this is very important as well, a vast inflow of immigrants, mostly German and Irish, caused this U-shaped population trend for Blacks. And we have to remember that is a very small percentage of the population that, and honestly, they were in a stiff competition for the jobs that were available. Before we move on to the job portion, it's important to note that who is participating in the workforce, who is working at the time. The presence of large numbers of immigrants meant that Black workers often faced stiff competition, even for very low status occupations, especially from Irish-born workers. And Blacks participated in the workforce at a much higher percentage. So this was called, I'm going to go back to the book and read directly from it for a moment. The higher labor force participation rates of Blacks were due to a number of factors, most of which centered around the lower earnings of their families. Blacks began work at a younger age, which was related to their receiving fewer years of education. Black workers were financially unable to retire as early as whites, and more Black family members, especially women, were needed as workers in order to cover basic necessities. I wish I could tell you that that's something in the long ago history, but it feels familiar still for many people. And you can open up to comments when when we're done with our summary here. So in effect, Black family members worked harder to earn less, primarily due to the restricted nature of the occupations in which they were employed. So I think Dr. Berteau mentioned that a majority of Black people were unable to secure the higher paying jobs in the many occupations that would have been in Cincinnati at the time. We have to remember that Cincinnati, pre-Civil War, the antebellum period, was a river city. So the steamboat industry, the travel, the delivery of goods and services along the Ohio River was the reason that Cincinnati was able to expand and become I believe, the 6th largest city in the United States for several of the decades in that century, in the century we're referring to here. So it was the fastest growing city, as you can see on my notes, during the first half of the century. During this period, most Black men worked as laborers, and Black women frequently worked as domestics, as Dr. Berteau had mentioned. And I wanted to refer back here to her words because they speak for themselves. And this was the first little bit of anecdotal information that she includes in the chapter. It's from Timothy Flint, who was the publisher of the Western Monthly Review. And I like how she sprinkles in these voices that can kind of draw us in a little more around the statistics and everything. So Timothy Flint had reckoned in 1830 that Cincinnati was the central market town for 1 million people. Now that's astounding if you think of the general population of the United States. So we're talking about a major hub in our country. He goes on to say that Cincinnati's borderland status, that word comes up again and again. He noted that the evils of slavery are not confined to the parts of the country where involuntary labor exists, but the neighborhood is infected. Certain kinds of labor are despised as being the work of slaves. So some of these menial jobs and laboring type of jobs were not desirable by white people, and they were not, I mean, I think the riverfront was important to both Blacks and whites, and we'll find out later how industrialization changed that and actually made the situation worse for Black workers. But I thought that was kind of interesting to note that even then, folks were recognizing that just because Ohio was a free state didn't mean that there was open arms, to Black workers. Dr. Berteau had mentioned that becoming a barber was the most prestigious choice available to Black men. And I believe the statistic on that was 16%, I believe, of Black men in the workforce were barbers. So that was one way. And then a small number found relative success in the fields of catering and steamboat stewards. That all kind of changes after the war and industrialization, but we're talking about the first part of the century here. And again, we go back to the competition. We know that a massive influx of German and Irish immigrants were coming into Cincinnati. And we also know that a lot of the Irish in particular were dealing with illiteracy, and they were pretty much on the level playing field with Black workers, and so they were very in intense competition for those jobs. I've got here something supplemental I'd like to read about that particular aspect of it. These German and Irish immigrants were willing to do menial labor and greatly restricted job opportunities for Black men, as there was nothing left for them but the lowest form of drudgery, for which employers often preferred colored women. It was therefore necessary in some cases for the mother to earn the living for the family because the father could get nothing to do. And that's a quote from a newspaper from Cincinnati, 1938. We have another little back in time blurb from a Black traveler to Cincinnati in 1827 that I'd like to read. Again, it kind of transports us back because it's a voice from the past. So I'd like to read that. I thought about coming to a free state like Ohio, and I would find every door thrown open to receive me. But the treatment I received by the people generally, I found it little better than in Virginia. I found every door was closed against the colored man in a free state, excepting the jails and penitentiaries. Indeed, even the poorhouse was closed to blacks, as another of the provisions of the black laws, and they come back again, mentioned earlier. Destitute, unemployed blacks were ineligible for poor relief. So we're not getting any breaks here, folks. No breaks and no opportunities to elevate your status or your job opportunities. So we're going to, I just want to mention that systemically and institutionally, blacks were also denied membership in early trade unions, and white workers protested working with blacks frequently, especially if they were not in a subordinate position. Dr. Berteau mentioned that with the teachers, and I'll get to that at the very end because I wanted to mention education as well before we open up our discussion. I had another comment about the trade unions before we move on to industrialization. Blacks were also barred from city jobs, such as public health inspector and firemen, on the grounds that the public, as well as fellow employees, would object to taking orders from blacks or working in close quarters with them. So it just wasn't realistically possible. And on top of the general ideas of racism and the fact that emancipated blacks who did make it to Cincinnati were also not viewed in a favorable light. They primarily had been in agriculture, of course, and when they get to the city, they're just not used to the urban environment, and they don't have any literacy skills that can be utilized to get better jobs. And so they were looked at in a very unfavorable light by the white people in general. It says here, and I thought this was interesting, I had to look up a word, hod carrier, H-O-D, hod carrier. And it's basically an old-fashioned way of saying a brick. It would be a white person to a bricklayer and skilled trades. And they had unions for these types of jobs, but of course, blacks were not permitted to join the unions. It does say here that later on in the century, in Cincinnati, only 8 Cincinnati blacks were found in trade unions. Now, this is by the end of the century, 1890. The majority of these 8 people, these 8 men, were older men, mostly bricklayers, and of the latter, all were said to be so light in color as not to be noticed among the sunburned and brick dust covered men. At the same time, Cincinnati's bricklayers locals refused to honor the traveling cards of visiting union-affiliated black bricklayers. So even if you had your union card from another state, and you came traveling here looking for work, you were denied that work. So we come to the mid of the century where we have the Civil War, we're emancipating, we're transitioning to an industrial city. Cincinnati evolved as a commercially based walking city focused on the riverfront and became a sprawling manufacturing industrial center after the 1860s. I think I mentioned earlier that it was the 6th largest city in the country, but after that changeover to industrialization, It was the nation's third largest manufacturing center. So all those jobs from the riverfront, the labor, the main jobs that Black men were able to secure are now being transitioned. The Industrial Revolution deeply affected the lives of both Black and white workers because it changed the distribution of job opportunities. And that's really brought home in the book. The steamboat travel and trade made way to railroads, and the decline of the steamboat caused a disproportionate amount of burden on Black men whose majority occupation centered around the riverfront. And I hope everybody can understand that. We can talk about that a little bit later if anybody has any questions. The white men were hired for the factory jobs, the good jobs, and were able to make those transitions, where Blacks were rarely hired for the new factory jobs. And then I really thought this was an interesting point. White women and children were increasingly employed in many manufacturing establishments, while Black women increasingly worked in jobs that white women had abandoned. And this was the most interesting sentence that just jumped off the page at me, that in effect, Blacks were picking up job market leftovers. And that was just something that stuck out in my mind as I read the chapter. I'm going to briefly touch on education because I want to open it up to conversation. I know Dr. Berteau mentioned that there was a small group of teachers who were Black in the Black schools. I'll point out a few bullet points here. Blacks were heavily discriminated against in the educational arena, and Black youth were barred from attending public schools that had been opened in 1829. So several private schools did operate for Blacks intermittently over the early part of the century, but it was reported that in 1845, over half of Cincinnati's Blacks were illiterate. So they're just not getting the educational benefit. A tiny group of Black women taught in the segregated Black public schools during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But these jobs were phased out as desegregation legislation passed at the state level, and white parents would not allow Blacks to teach classes that included white pupils. And Dr. Berteau did touch on that, but I thought it was a good example, perfect example really, of how even when the institutional racism is eliminated, so desegregation becomes a law, and we think, okay, desegregation, done, check it off. No, because it was actually a step backwards for these educated Black people, mostly women and some principal men as well, who had been in the more prestigious position of being teachers and principals, because in essence, their jobs were phased out due to racism. There were no more legal barriers, but they were still not going to be teaching in those schools with the white students. So they lost their positions due to that. So I'm going to just conclude by reading one of the paragraphs from the book at the end here. I did want to mention that I got really curious about population now in our city, and I looked up the 2010 census, which was the last piece of information I was able to get, the most current. And in that census, there were 50.7% white people and 42.3% Black. And I don't know about you, I'm very lucky. I live in Mount Washington, and I live in a diverse neighborhood, but it kind of confounds me that we're still apart. You know, we are still apart, and that's a teaser for next month when we talk about housing. So in conclusion, for my summary here, I hope I've hit the key points, and I know Miss Melanie is going to fill in for me the gaps that she finds are really relevant and important. But I'll just read the end here. It would appear that the more informal varieties of racial discrimination, let me stop sharing this so we can all see each other. The more informal varieties of racial discrimination proved more than equal to the task of keeping Blacks at the bottom of the occupational ladder. Continuing informal barriers based on race, as well as the cumulative effects of past discrimination, mean that conscious analysis and concerted action will be required to truly upgrade the occupational status of the Black community as a whole. So I'll end on that note and pass the torch to Melanie. She's our resident expert, and I hope that I was able to highlight and make a little sense of the way things looked during that 19th century and when we were forming as a city and developing ourselves. Melanie, do you want to make some comments now?
Yes, I just want to share the screen and use the slides. They help me. Everybody can hear me okay? All righty. I'm assuming you can. If not, just let me know. Okay, this is the cover of the book. That's what the cover looks like. Race in the City, Work, Community, and Protest in Cincinnati, 1820 to 1970. And for me, this book proves and explains the wealth gap, starting with employment. As Dr. Berteau so wonderfully shows with the data and even the anecdotes. The green line is the white population. This is the share of net wealth in all U.S. households. Black is the yellow line right down here. Latino, they're down at the bottom, and other are down at the bottom. This is from 1989 to 2019, and the source is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is real. When I show this graph, I tell people this isn't a drawing that my 6-year-old granddaughter drew for me. This is statistically accurate. There is a wealth gap. The gentleman that you've heard his name mentioned, Dr. Henry Louis Taylor Jr., he is the gentleman that edited and compiled this book for the Cincinnati Bicentennial in 1988. It was published by the University of Illinois Press in 1993. And his research focuses on a historical and contemporary analysis of distressed urban neighborhoods, social isolation, and race and class issues among people of color, especially African Americans and Latinos. I'm in communication with Dr. Taylor, and we're hoping to get him in on one of our discussions. This is the website. This is my, on YouTube. In the search box, if you type in Race and the City chapters, it will bring this image up. If you click on this, those are the 12 videos in the playlist, and each chapter is a video of its own. I would like for this YouTube channel, this playlist, to be used as a virtual book club. I would love to see people listen to the reading of the book, leave comments in the comment section, questions, reply, and interact right there on the YouTube channel. This is from the Cincinnati Historical Society, 1967, talking about the Cincinnati riots of 1862. And there is a plaque about the mob violence of 1862. This is just before the Civil War. The historian Stephen J. Ross relates the following incident from the early months of the Civil War, when Cincinnati's river trade was severely disrupted and violence erupted amid the hardships of unemployment among dock workers. So Catherine did an excellent job. She pointed out just almost everything, so there's not very much that I need to do. She really covered the points that I wanted, but she talked about that tension between the Irish and the Blacks, Irish in particular, that were competing for work. So it says here, quote, screaming, "Let's clear out the niggers." Irish dock workers, angered by the attempts of Black laborers to underbid them for jobs, initiated a 2-day riot in July 1862, which left a trail of destruction that stretched from the city's docks into the Black homes along the levee. And this is the industrialization that was taking place after the Civil War. And you see that children, white women were employed in these jobs, not Black men. As the pace of industrialization accelerated in the 1870s and 1880s, mechanization was increasingly utilized and many jobs became more specialized. To save on labor costs, lower paid white women and children were increasingly employed in many manufacturing establishments. Blacks were rarely hired for these new factory jobs. So you wonder, maybe child labor laws? Maybe child labor laws? Okay, coming now more into the more recent times, this is a document. Derek Hamilton did some research, the racial composition of American jobs. This was in 2006. And just want to read what Derek Hamilton said about this. 35 years after Barbara Bergman espoused the theory that Black males, now that's 35 years prior to 2006, so that was like 1971. She had a theory that Black males are systematically crowded into lower earning occupations. Occupational crowding is still relevant today. White employers' refusal to hire Blacks in certain types of jobs forces them to cluster and creates crowding in less desirable jobs, reinforcing a condition of lower earnings in those occupations. Today, 2006, there is a general pattern of exclusion in the most desired management, professional, and related sector, even for Blacks that have the requisite educational qualifications. This is Dr. Derek Hamilton's prescription for change in 2006. Labor market interventions such as anti-discrimination laws and affirmative action policies are still needed and must be strengthened, and I add, and enforced, to redress the systematic crowding of Blacks into low-wage jobs and exclusion from high-wage jobs. The racial unemployment gaps are widest for employees without college degrees. So there's less than high school. The blue is Black. The red is non-Hispanic white. Then you've got your high school. There's still a major gap, but the same amount of education, some college. So it lessens as we get up into bachelor's degrees and higher, but there is still that gap. June 11, 2020, Joint Economic Committee, Congressman Don Beyer, Vice Chair, the Economic State of Black America in 2020. Discrimination and occupational segregation are significant causes of racial disparities. Field experience have shown that resumes with typically Black-sounding names receive significantly fewer callbacks for job interviews than those with white-sounding names, even when candidates have identical qualifications. A meta-analysis of these experiments has shown almost no change in the level of hiring discrimination among Blacks over the past 25 years. There also is evidence of Black employment being concentrated in occupations that, now this goes back to Barbara Bergman's 1971, Derek Hamilton's 2006. We are now in June 11, 2020. There is also evidence of Black employment being concentrated in occupations that have a higher risk of unemployment, often because of automation. Black workers also are at higher risk of being the first fired in the event of an economic downturn. And that's all I want to share. Thank you so much, Catherine. You did an excellent job. I just wanted to bring everybody sort of up to speed. So I will stop sharing. And please, if you have any questions, comments, a lot of information, a lot of paradigm shifting, trying to connect synapses, trying to grasp all of this information that was new to me when I first read the chapter. And I've been here for 67 years. So please feel free to make comments, ask questions.
Melanie?
Yes.
You had that graph that you showed about wealth. It was like your second slide or something like that.
The red and black bars?
Yeah,
Or was it the wealth gap?
the wealth gap. That's the one.
The wealth gap? Yes, I've got that. You wanted it?
Well, I was curious, not that this is a good thing, but the only movement that seemed to happen in that entire graph was around the year 2005, right? And I was curious if you had any insights into what that movement was. And I know it wasn't for the Blacks, but it was some movement. So I was just curious.
I'll look that up. What was going on in 2005, correct?
I'd have to look at your chart again to verify the year, but it seemed right around there.
Okay, let me see if I can bring that up.
And while you're looking that up, Melanie, it seems to me that, in the more recent decades, when Black workers were able to start securing jobs in those factory jobs, the Fords, the manufacturing, the, unionized positions, just when that seemed, maybe this has to do with that, maybe just when that was taking hold and some progress was being made, the focus on manufacturing started to tank, and the focus on technology jobs and innovation replaced those. So it was almost a displacement again, like we saw when Cincinnati went from a riverfront focus to an industrial focus. Do you think that might have something to do with it, or?
Possibly. I really have to look closer. Maybe I can, get some information on, but I see what she's talking about here. The 2005, that upkick. However, that upkick looks like it's on the blue line, which is other. And I really don't know who's in other. For Blacks, it's very minimal. It's much more flat.
Yeah, for the Blacks, I didn't notice any movement, but I just thought it was interesting that the only movement was right there, it seems like. Everything else is pretty much completely level the whole way.
Yeah. Was that Kathleen?
Yes.
Okay, and I think Dot, you have your hand up?
Yes, I'm just, when did the first affirmative action economic, and job placement and job applications and that sort of thing, when was that legislation kicking in? How far back was that? And why do you think it hasn't made any difference, significant difference?
Anybody know when affirmative action legislation started? Anybody want to Google it?
It was in certainly by 2000.
Well, I would say, and I don't know this to be the case, but Derek Hamilton in his research was saying that, affirmative action definitely needs to be strengthened. And I don't feel that it was enforced. I don't feel that it was enforced.
That's probably obviously correct, because it didn't make any difference.
No, we don't see any evidence of it making any difference
Well-
whatsoever. And then you've got that faction that came in about reverse discrimination. So then
Still there.
politicians had to grapple with the white community saying, well, you're putting unqualified blacks in a seat in a university, and my child excels beyond, above and beyond that black child, and they're not able to get into school. So they're, you know, in an uproar and causing issues there.
In 1961, affirmative action began. My goodness. But in 1961, when I went to work at IBM, I graduated from college, and there was a class of 6 of us who began working at IBM, and all the men in the class made $75 a month more than the women. And there wasn't any question of race. They're all white.
Right.
But, you know, lots of discrimination in the 60s and 70s. I couldn't buy a car without my husband's signature.
Wow.
And women couldn't get any credit ratings unless they had separate bank accounts. And so I remember opening a bank account to establish some credit, and I started making the mortgage payments so that I could have some credit on my record. But that was the easy stuff for me. And I'm very familiar with the redlining and the housing issues, which are going to come up in the future. But I'm just fascinated that today on television and in most kind of visible public positions, there seems to be much more impact and equality in terms, maybe not equality, but much more impact of minority representation than there is in some other areas. But I just wonder why it hasn't been more effective on this chart. This chart goes clear up to 2019.
Yes. Well, that's the share of net worth of all U.S. households.
And then
So,
even if you got good jobs, the fact that there was so much redlining and lack of loans to minority groups and that sort of thing, it's mostly households that build our wealth.
exactly. Exactly. And you're going to hear more about this next week when it comes to housing. It's going to make it really crystal clear to you. You know, with regard to the redlining, we were redlined into deteriorating communities, deteriorating homes. And then you live there for a while with making hardly any money, maybe enough to pay the income taxes, the insurance, you know, to feed your family. Where is the money to do the improvements on that house? So it continues to deteriorate even more and more. And we all know, this has been stated in the media, that a house in a black community is valued much, much less than the exact same house in a white community. So you've got that going against you. So we can't build that wealth. And this is net worth, you know, and like you said, you know, the value of your home. My home in Evanston, where I live now, is maybe worth $65,000. The same house in Anderson Township or someplace else maybe would be worth $85,000. So I'm just that, you know, much less.
Yeah, well, and the other impact that we've had, which I'm not a Cincinnatian, but I was so struck with what happened when they built I-75 and they just wiped out the West End.
Mhm.
And then there was kind of a mass migration to Avondale and whatever. And then they built I-71 right through the middle of Evanston.
Mhm.
And you know, and to this day, Ronald Reagan Highway stops because Indian Hills got the power to say, no, not in our neighborhood. And I mean, there's no reason that Ronald Reagan Highway shouldn't run clear through to 275, but it doesn't, which is because of the neighborhood that was there. If Lincoln Heights was where Indian Hills was, it would go right through. It was, you know, it's just so many different areas. And the big question is, okay, how do we do anything about it? How do we really make significant change?
Well, hopefully we're going to talk about that. Cassie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to address what Dot was referring to. Why hasn't the affirmative action worked? And like this chapter champion, it reiterated about the Black codes. We really still have subtle Black codes today. Where the voter suppression in the South, they discouraged them, all the way up to the 30s and 40s and 50s even. And Black men are arrested for the smallest things. And so most of our men are in prison. And, it's just to put it simply, it is systemic racism, where we're not allowed or afforded the same privilege as another race. So but and still we rise.
Amen. And against such odds, against such obstacles, yes, we have done well. Unfortunately, media hones in on those that have been able to break through. The majority of us, as evidenced by that graph, the majority of us are still on the bottom, but they don't show that. Media doesn't show that. They try to avoid that image. And I just want to say, Holly is here. She's one of my chapter champions. I see Holly. Thank you for coming. Okay, did somebody else have a comment or a question?
Yes, I did. This is Michael.
Yes.
I think Catherine just made a note in the chat that kind of reflects what I was going to say. The informal practices of racism prevents the move of the needle as well. I think of it this way: if a person's sitting behind the desk and they're making the hiring decision, and when they're making their hiring decision, they're hiring individuals that they're comfortable with, that looks like them, that they hang around in the same communities, they are in the same groups, or present less of a challenge for them, they're going to hire those that they're most comfortable with. One of the things that I think I hear quite often is we can't find qualified individuals for these positions. And the question that I always pose to those that raise that question: where are you looking?
Right.
If you're looking in all of the if you're looking in your alma mater, if you're looking at the schools that have the reputations that bring the cachet with them, then you may not find the individuals that you're looking for. And I think of the HBCUs, which the HBCUs, they graduate more engineers, they graduate more doctors, they graduate in all of the categories that individuals say we are lacking students in. They have higher graduation rates for those, right? But you have to go to those locations. And the question is, do businesses in other locations invest the dollars and the time to do the recruitment where individuals are, right? And so those are some of those challenges that I think impacts the reasons why you don't have those, the move of the needle. And then you still have those issues of, are you giving equitable pay for individuals when you hire them in, right? And so that becomes another issue why you don't have the wealth gap, right? And then you also have the issue of, if an individual has to take out more loans in order to pay for their education, they start further away from the starting line, right? And so they have a steeper incline. So all of those things together, it's a complex issue. There's a variety of things that go into impacting why that wealth gap and opportunity isn't as visible as we would like for it to be.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
I think I'd like to touch on something Michael evoked in my mind, and it's fairly impressionistic. And as a white man, I'm counting my blessings every day for my privileges and wanting to learn and listen. So when Michael says, where do you look and what do you do and how do you pay? those things resonate with me. And I wanted to point out last summer before COVID, maybe it was spring, I was in a very large room in downtown Cincinnati with a workforce development breakfast to talk about the state of workforce health in the greater Cincinnati region. And it almost instantly turned into a conversation with statistics about the great labor shortage of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. And then it turned into what we need to do is tap into the reentry workforce. And all I have to say about that is when I looked around the room, there was kind of a look of perplexity. What does that mean? I've never thought of that before. And then to add a little bit more substance to my impressionistic thoughts, we had roundtable discussions afterwards. And I was with a group of about 8 to 10 people, honestly saying, I just didn't know about the reentry workforce. I never thought about it. And it was really a moment for me that kind of speaks to this collective misunderstanding that people could have about the plight of folks with more barriers than other people. Now, I do have hope that the needle is moving a little bit, and with every step of the way, when society is learning about things like shortage in the labor market, well, where did that come from? And what do we do about it? Going back to Michael's comments of where do we look, how do we pay, really resonate with me.
Now, Michael, David, you said re-entry. Is that re-entry from prisons? Or?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So in other words, the bottom line of this breakfast, this small conference of business people, was we need to hire re-entering citizens coming back from prisons because we're not finding workers elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And I just want to throw that out there as something for us to think about.
Absolutely.
David, did it seem like the employers that were at that particular event were willing or open to that idea, or was it that they felt that was their only option at that point?
Well, since I'm talking anonymously about it, I remember one of the moderators saying, well, it's not only the thing we need to do, it's the right thing to do. And I'll just leave that there as well.
I hope that if that kind of progress can keep going, it's very, very difficult. Melanie mentioned so much the incarceration levels of Black men, and that reentry, golly, that is just a huge barrier to getting your life back together, becoming, employed. So I'm cautiously optimistic by what you just said, David.
I'm an optimist, so I want to infuse an optimism in this, but I kind of wanted to point out kind of a strange aha moment that a lot of people had because they hadn't thought about it before, or it wasn't part of their experience.
If I could add about one of the problems with reentering citizens is that there are so many areas and laws in Ohio where they're not allowed to be licensed, like get a barber's license or work in the healthcare industry, and you can't do anything with any children and all this kind of thing. And the Ohio Justice and Policy Center actually has a program where you can apply, where a returning citizen can apply for a waiver for the employer, so that the employer cannot be sued if the returning citizen violates their parole or does something wrong. The customer can't sue the employer for having hired this returning citizen. But right now, apparently they can sue. If you buy and they were a cashier at a restaurant or something, and someone claims they were shortchanged or whatever, the employer can be sued. But it's a very arduous process. It was a 29-page online application that these guys had to tell their whole story and why they thought they were going to be okay. And it's a program that's ongoing, but there are so many restrictions. And that's one of the reasons, in addition to just plain prejudice, that employers don't want to hire ex-felons particularly.
It's a complicated maze that I'm learning more about. And it goes back to these federal contracts a lot of times, or whether it's state funded employment, federal funded employment. And I've even heard that folks with felonies can't be eligible for past felonies for particular jobs because Homeland Security gets in the way too. So talk about systems.
And that's current, that's right now. And Homeland Security wasn't even in existence 20 years ago.
Liz, did you have something to say?
I did. I can't find the button to raise my hand. I can just applaud,
yeah,
but I can't.
Okay.
Certainly, hiring people that are reentering the workforce from prison is a great thing and something that they deserve, but even more so not sending them to prison in the first place. And I've done a lot of reading about the prison industry and convict leasing and the whole, it's just awful. It's just awful. And how, really high level people were involved in this business of humankind after Reconstruction. So it's almost like we can't make the system work. We need a whole new system. And I saw a good video on YouTube, on Facebook last week about liberation economy, because the white man's profit economy just isn't good for anybody. So that we need to rethink economics altogether, which is hard. But trying to make things work in the profit-oriented mindset that's been going on since colonial days I don't think it's ever going to be satisfying.
Thanks, Liz. It looks like we are close to our time. It's 7:25. So if no one has said anything yet and you have something on your mind, please do so now.
Hi, yes, my name is Jill Gaines, and I actually wanted to add a comment. What Dave said had me thinking when he was talking about reentry and something that hadn't been thought of. I was recently contacted by my HR in a social service agency, and in their initiatives for diversity, equity, and inclusion, actually contacted me about making my salary more equal to peers. So basically admitting that I had been brought in as an African-American woman at a lower rate. And my record shows that I have performed well. And they brought me in to actually raise my pay, not a general raise that you would get for performance, but just to equal out more, to change that wealth gap. And I'm thought, wow, what work there is to be done, that I was even contacted for something like that. But that is another idea, just saying, let's make this more equitable. And I thought, wow, that's something to think about and hope that more people kind of maybe catch on.
Yes. Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? Thank you for sharing. I know, what I was saying about affirmative action. We need, in my opinion, we need affirmative action on steroids. Affirmative action on steroids. And I would like to see an outside agent hold the hand of HBCUs and perhaps those that are reentering and work on behalf of the new hires, whether they be in managerial positions or entry-level positions. But they need support. Also be an outside agent if the new hire has an issue, wants to file a complaint, then that agency that's holding their hand would walk them through that process and help them with that. So the outside agency would find employees for the company working hand in hand with their HR person, but they do not work for that company, so they are not biased. They're working for the new hires, holding the company's HR's hand and holding the hand of the HBCUs and other sources of Black employers. Somebody had their hand up.
I think it was Clara, someone who hadn't had a chance to speak yet. Claire, did you have something you wanted to say as we're rounding out the event here?
I did, but I'm a little shy.
You just go right ahead. There's no right or wrong.
Can you see me?
Yeah, now we can.
Okay. I just wanted to offer a little bit of hope in the end of the conversation. My name is Claire. I'm a employee at GE. Basically, I started my career about 2 years ago. I'm like fresh out of college. And there is hope. I have quite a few coworkers of color who are in this pretty prestigious leadership program that I'm in, and we all sort of band together and we work together to sort of talk about diversity and inclusion at GE, which is really exciting. And amongst us, one of us is a graduate from an HBCU down in Louisiana, which is so exciting. So there is progress being made. I don't want it to seem like there's not being progress made. But on the topic, we also have to remember there's a sense of intersectionality equipped in this. For instance, one of my coworkers' daughters is a graduate of an HBCU. She's the only female engineer of color at her company, and she thinks of quitting every single day, which is just so disheartening because there's just no representation in her field. Every time she has a problem, she can't just turn to one of her coworkers like I can and be like, hey, are you experiencing this problem? I find this really difficult. She has to, call up her mom, call up her friends who also graduated from the same college. So there's definitely progress, but also, maybe not as quickly as we would hope. But I just figured a young perspective could be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I really appreciate you sharing your experience, your personal experience. That speaks to me. I always like to have someone or some voice, whether it's from the past in these articles or a person right in front of me, to give me that personal perspective and kind of draw me into the story. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been super educational.
Melanie, I think you're muted. Started off on mute, we're ending on mute.
Okay, I was directing it to David to see if he had any housekeeping things and close us out.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Catherine. And I really value hearing the perspectives tonight. Please join us next month. I will check the date. It's the last Wednesday of February, February 24th, for our second edition of Critical Conversations of Race in the City. Now, it's important to Melanie to share with all of you that chapter list on YouTube. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. And I put that chapter list as an attachment in the chat, so I'm hoping you'll be able to access that. But what I can do as a follow-up tomorrow is send that list to all of us as registered, participants, and I'll send an email tomorrow morning so you'll have access to that so that you can listen to the chapters for the next two events. I just want to thank everyone, and I'll hand it off to Melanie for some closing remarks.
I don't have any closing remarks. I just want to thank everybody for coming. I'm just so thrilled that you're interested in this topic, and sharing your thoughts and ideas is just fantastic. And do come back next month.
And I'll just add, David, I put my email address in the chat. If anyone wants to reach out to me or continue the conversation or have questions that possibly I could bounce ideas around with you, I'm happy to do that. So my email address is in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and good night. Take care. Be safe. Good night.
Thank you.